I want you to see very quickly in chapter 14 Jonathan's victory and how it comes about. Because in spite of the fact that chapter 14 is, it's relatively long, if you take a look at the first half of the chapter, 1 to 15, what you have is a story about how victory comes about. I want to give you 3 things. They're fast, they're easy, okay? The first one is in the first 5 verses. So 1 to 15 is our story. Do you notice that 16 in your text is 16 a little darker? The numbers, okay, that's the beginning of another paragraph. So 1 to 15 is how this victory comes about with this small group of people. This is Jonathan and his band. And in 1 to 5, I just want you to put next to verses 1 to 5 the word planning. And planning in this case were spies. He sent reconnaissance. Jonathan took his loyal guard and he attempted to spy and perhaps even attack a small outpost near Gibeah. But he didn't inform his father in verse 1. He did not tell Saul. He just went and did it. Jonathan had to climb down and scale up to the plateau of a garrisoned fortress in order to look in and see what was going on there. So verses 1 to 5 talk about how he scales down in and comes up into this crevice and is looking in and seeing what the garrison of the Philistines is like. Garrison for you, if you're not sure what that is, would be like a stockade fence. Take a bunch of pine trees, chop them off with little points on top and put them around the outside of a little area and put your guys encamped on the inside in tents. That's a garrison. In order to see how many people are inside of it, you either have to get higher than it and look down, and that's the reason why you tend to put them on the highest hill, or you have to actually get up and be able to peer in and see how many guys and start counting out how many squads are there and how much you're going to have to take on. So there's planning involved in the first 5 verses. Then when you get down to the next set of verses, down to, let's say, 6 through 12, here's what I want you to see. Jonathan tells his guard, okay, let's go down to them and see if God will choose to defeat them through us. And his guards agree. That's what verses 6 and 7 are all about. So he gets his armor bearers or his guards and he says, let's go down, let's take a look at exactly what's there and see if God will give them into our hand. Now, in verses 8 through 12, he says, okay, we'll go and be seen. If they say that they will come to us, we won't do anything. But if they tell us to come to them, they think that's like the symbol we'll know to see that God is going to defeat them. In other words, he sort of puts a little fleece out there. He says, all right, if they say this, we know God wants us to defeat them. If they say that, we know we should back off and not do anything. Jonathan's method isn't so much planning. Next to verses 6 through 12, I put the word proving or testing. Proving. And so he lays out there sort of a little test. And verse 11 says, when both of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines said, behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. Do you hear in verse 11 how haughty the Philistines are? Look at the little Israelites coming out of their holes. Oh, that's so cute. Verse 12, so the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us and we will tell you something. And Jonathan said to the armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. It appears to me Jonathan's relationship with the Lord was solid and that Jonathan knew what God wanted him to do. It's not clear in the text exactly how he knew, because in verse 6 he said, maybe the Lord will do this for us, perhaps he will do it for us. But it's clear to me that Jonathan had confidence that if he heard certain words, he knew that God was going to do this. He turns to the guys around him and he says, God's given him into our hands. In verses 13 and 14 and 15, I have the word written performing. I have planning, proving, and now I have the word performing. And the word performing, what I mean is Jonathan goes in confidence and he takes them on, defeating 20 or so men and chasing them back. And God sends panic into the Philistines to disrupt the tiny attack. You have to understand something. Jonathan has a sword. Most of Israel doesn't. But the Philistines don't know how many of them have swords. So when he comes and he shows up and he's able to be adept with a sword and kill 20 guys, the Philistines start panicking like everybody's got swords. Remember this one statement. It actually comes from General George Patton. Never ask a wounded soldier how the battle is going. Because once you're wounded, you tend to see everyone as stronger. In other words, once you take on a wound, you don't see the battle the way it really is. You see it worse than it really is. Remember that whenever you sit down and talk to somebody who is personally, emotionally wounded, their view of the situation will be worse than it really is. Have you ever had have you ever gone through this? And this is really why I wanted to do this before we left. Have you ever gone through a time where like there's a lot of problems in your life and stuff's really going on and you just feel like it's all falling apart? And then you like go to sleep, wake up, and the next day it's not as bad? Now your life didn't get better while you slept, but you feel better, right? In other words, can we all agree that the way you see it isn't always really the way it is? It's more the way you feel about it? So the Philistines here get into a panic mode. I want you to drop your eyes from 13 to 15. It says, Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and the armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. What's interesting is he's climbing up on a precipice, and guys are coming toward him, and he's able to fight them off because they're on a steep precipice. And so somebody's going to fall off, okay? And so guys are falling off, and Jonathan seems to be more stable and able to fight against them. In verse 14, the first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about half a furrow in an acre of land. He's going across the neck of land, and he's battling them, and he's tossing them off and battling them, and they're falling before him, and he's making a way across a half acre of ground. There was trembling in the camp in the field and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked so that it became a great trembling. In other words, you started to see people panic. I'm not saying it was an earthquake. I'm saying there was so much movement in the camp as people were grabbing their stuff to try and run that the whole ground was shaking. He's trying to give you a sort of a dramatic flair for what happens. And what I want you to see is that this story is that Jonathan goes in with a small number of people, and he accomplishes a big feat, confident of what the Lord wanted him to do. But what's really cool about this is that he not only did some planning, he took what the Lord had put in his heart to do, and he went out and he performed it, and God set the panic in order. Now, here's the problem. The big weakness for Jonathan's life was what? When you read through Jonathan's story, what's the big weakness in Jonathan's life? In 2 words, his dad. Jonathan's a really good guy with a really not good dad. He's a really surrendered guy with a really not surrendered dad. Jonathan is the picture of an incredible friend in the Bible. But just because he's trying to do right doesn't mean his dad's trying to do right. So the second half of the chapter is all going to be about the boneheaded stunt of his dad. So what ends up happening is Saul is very, very wrong in his prescription of what he does that day. When we come back, we're going to pick up what's called Saul's foolish order, but really it's about Jonathan doing right and having victory, and then this contrast of Saul, who doesn't listen to God, who is insecure. Jonathan is a secure guy. His dad is not. By the way, Jonathan's probably the most likely to die in the story. Why? Because Saul's line will be cut off, and you're in Saul's line, so it's probably not going to fare well for you. Jonathan saw an opportunity, and this is where he emerges as a leader of his own right. Up until this point in the story, he's an appendage to Saul. But he's got a group of men. You heard that he had a sword and Saul had a sword. But now you start to see he takes his garrison and he decides to make a move. Now, they should have stopped there. But instead of stopping there, they go ahead and Saul tries to make something out of it. And that's where it falls flat. Jonathan follows what the Lord puts in his heart. Doesn't feel it's necessary to tell Saul. If you're asking, do I think it was a good thing? Yeah, I do think it was a good thing in that particular case. Okay? Dennis?
This is about part 2, the planning. How does this apply to our lives? Because, I mean, obviously, Jonathan, somehow knew if they do this, that's God's will. If it's this, it's not God's will.
Yeah, here's what's not in the passage. How does Jonathan know what he knows? So there are other passages of Scripture that will help address that. This isn't one of them. This is really one half of a high contrast picture. I just gave you the white half, and when we come back, I'll give you the black half. And you'll see them set against one another. And you know how I mean that, good against bad. So one of the things you do, Dennis, is you don't look for the answer to this problem in every passage. You look for the passage and ask, what does this answer? Not, I need this answer, let me find it in these verses. It's the opposite, okay? Luke.
Do you think after Samuel told Saul that his kingdom wasn't going to be forever, that Jonathan knew he wasn't
Yes.
next, not, he probably would die then because...
Jonathan actually answers this question for you. No, he doesn't think it's about his death. He does, later on in the story, when you were reading through the story, you may remember, what does Jonathan do for David? Jonathan surrenders his armor to David and says, you're going to be king, not me.
So he knows.
Jonathan doesn't necessarily know he's going to die. He just knows he's not going to get the job. And he doesn't have a problem with that. And he sticks with that, and he's okay being the second man. He's okay being second. It doesn't bother him. Jonathan loves David. Now, not yet, but Jonathan loves David, and when we get there, he will have no problem with God calling him to be the assistant instead of being the guy. There are people who are called to be the guy. There are other people that are called to be the supporter of the guy. And if you're called to be a supporter of the guy, you're okay with that. That's what you want to do. I've known men who served faithfully as assistants to others for their whole career, and they loved it. They never wanted to be the guy. They wanted to be the guy who helps the guy. And there's nothing wrong with that. Jonathan was really okay, but I don't think he thought he was going to die. Not until you get to about chapter 28, then I think he figures out he's going to die. And that's because he dies with Saul's folly. He keeps following what his father's doing, even though his father's king. What choice do you have? You do what the king says. But the king keeps doing stupid things. And as he gets more and more boneheaded, the problem is worse and worse and worse. And by the end, 1 Samuel 28 to 31, both of them are going to get wiped out in the war at the end of the book. Spoiler alert, I told you who dies. Okay. Saul died, as if you thought maybe he was still walking around outside, okay? All right, let's have a word of prayer, please. One of you ladies, please.
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for class, and thank you that we're all here and that we're all learning more about Saul's life. Lord, thank you for pastoring.
And behold, the multitude melted away, and they went here and there. Saul said to the people who were gone with him, number now and see who has gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. Now what's interesting is Israel's men were scared, and some of them left Saul's side, forcing him to recount. But that's when he discovered for the first time Jonathan's departure. So somebody asked earlier, why would we know that Jonathan hadn't told Saul? The important thing is, think about what's going through Saul's mind when he finds people defecting left and right, and they do a count, and Jonathan is gone. Now he's got to be wondering something about Jonathan, right? And that's part of what you're supposed to go. Question mark comes up in his mind over Jonathan because Jonathan isn't there. Now I want you to look at verses 18 and 19 and look at the misjudgment that this misguided king gave. Saul told the priest to bring the ark, but when the confusion ensued, he decided to leave his time listening to the Lord and move with haste for a military advantage. So he said, bring the ark, as though he were going to seek God's face. Seems like the right thing to do, but then he gets too rushed and he doesn't listen to God. So you see it in verse 18. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here, for the ark of God was at that time with the sons of Israel, meaning it had been taken back after the Philistines had it. While Saul talked to the priest, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. In essence, he was going to listen for what God had to say, but then things overtook him. Now, notice in verses 20 to 23 the confusion of the enemy. Saul arrived to see the Philistines battling internally for control, and Israelites that had sided with Philistine protection came to the side of Saul. The Lord gave Saul's men victory in the hill country because men who originally sided with the Philistines switched sides during the battle. Now, watch what happens. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle. And behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was great confusion. Now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard the Philistines had fled, even they also pursued them closely in the battle. So the Lord delivered Israel that day after the battle spread beyond Beth Aven. Now, you see this great moment of victory. It was a small group, Jonathan's group, followed by another group, a group that's with Saul, when Saul appears to look like he's wanting to follow the Lord, and God gives him a victory. But now the middle of the text from verse 24 onward turns south. This is the king with the big mouth. He was doing so well, and now he's not. I want you to see that there's a principle for the rest of this passage, for verse 24 to the end of the chapter. How we think determines what we accomplish. How we think determines what we accomplish. See, God told him both what to think and how to accomplish this thinking. God was the one who said, I really want you to think a certain way, and I will help you to be able to do that. How we think determines what we accomplish. I want you to first look at, by the way, the passage breaks down into three different kinds of thinking. Okay, there are three kinds of thinking in the passage. The first one is self-centered thinking. And I pick up in verse 24, self-centered thinking. And here's what it says. Now the men of Israel were hard pressed on that day, for Saul had put the people under oath, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. Why was that self-centered thinking? Why am I saying when Saul said to his men, "Nobody gets to eat until I have been avenged," why was that self-centered thinking? Yeah, notice the I and circle the I. I have been avenged. See, when they counted off, Jonathan was missing. And Saul wasn't sure what exactly had taken place right away. Now a battle ensues, and he feels that he's going to get vengeance on those who had come and pressed Israel. But he doesn't do it for the people's sake, he does it for his own sake. He took personally the infringement of the Philistine army and made the problems of the kingdom all about him. I want you to see in verse 24, Saul frames the problems of the kingdom as his own problem. Now, we have to be careful about how we look and how we think about things. And so I would tell you that verse 24 really does give you this self-centered thinking. But there's a second kind of thinking as well. In 25 and 26, there's what I would call untempered thinking. Untempered thinking or unbiblical thinking is Saul bound his troops to a death curse if they ate, making it difficult to accomplish the total victory against the Philistine armies because he said, "You die if you eat anything." By the way, what's that a violation of under the law? If you eat anything before we win, you die. What law does that violate? The one I was thinking of was the law of the balances. What is the law of the balances? Law of the scales, the law of the balances. It reads something like this: eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Yeah, Leviticus 19 is supposed to be a law of balances. The punishment has to fit the crime. You don't kill people for eating something. Okay? So that's not an eye for eye, tooth for tooth, so it's off balance. Okay? So that's Leviticus 19 verses 16 to 18. Now the important thing is this. He binds his troops to something that's a ridiculous command. Listen to verse 25. All the people of the land entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. When the people entered the forest, behold, there was a flow of honey, but no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. They are starving, and they can't eat the honey that's dripping right down onto the ground. They are in desperate shape, and he has made them against a vow, which was an inappropriate vow to begin with. Why? Because he had a big mouth. He got a chip on his shoulder about personal vengeance, and he went way too far. Now, take a look at the third kind of thinking. The third kind of thinking is what I would call limited thinking. Limited thinking. Jonathan hadn't heard the command of his father. And there was no provision for special circumstances like, what if people didn't hear? What about the wounded? Were they not supposed to get any food or water? You're supposed to let them lay there? Saul thought only of his immediate situation and not of the ramifications of what he was saying in his command. So it was very limited. It was self-centered, it was untempered, and it was very limited. This led to an exhausted army unable to complete the job. Look at the verses, because in verse 27 it says, "But Jonathan had not heard his father put the people under the oath. Therefore he put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, dipped it in the honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened." Meaning he was fading out. He was getting a sugar drop. He stuck it in there. He stuck it in his mouth. He hadn't heard anything, but there was no provisions on what Saul had said. Verse 28, then one of the people said, "Your father strictly put the people under the oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food today.' And the people were weary. Then Jonathan said, 'My father has troubled the land. See now how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. How much more if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they had found. For now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great. They struck among the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon, and the people were very weary. The people rushed greedily upon the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood." They were starving. Now, here's the problem. The problem is when you make something too hard for people to do, you put them in a bad position. There's a command for fathers in the New Testament not to provoke your children to wrath. We're going to see it when we're in Ephesians. Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. Essentially, the command is this: I can make someone else, I can't make them, I can deliver a very strong lean in someone else towards sin if my behavior causes them frustration at that level. What does it mean to provoke your children to wrath? How could a father provoke a child to an explosion of anger?
Like giving them a task that's too difficult and frustrates them.
One of the things you can do is give them a task that's beyond their ability to do, and they will fight hard to try and do it because they want to please you, but you will break the spirit of a child if you give them something beyond what they can do. Another one is to constantly ride them very hard for more than they do. You only got an A? How come not an A+? I mean, and you just push, and you push to a certain point and you'll break the spirit of the child. Essentially what happened here is Saul set this up in a way that he broke the spirit of a child. By the way, the same thing is true as in modesty. You can dress in a way that you provoke other people towards sin. It's not your fault, but it is part of your responsibility. You need to dress in a way that doesn't invite other people to sin. I mean, honestly, I think one of the things we know as a society is that it's hard enough to do right when you're trying to do right, but when people are falling all over you to do wrong, it's awfully difficult to do it. So I would just tell you that Saul just stupidly, in his limited thinking, really brought on a real problem. Now, because of the fact that they didn't clean up the full battle of the war, the whole field of battle, when you get down to verses 47 to 52, do you have in your text constant warfare? Okay. That's a good way of saying what happened as a result. Saul's big mouth precluded him beating the Philistines bad enough so that there wasn't constant problems. The fact is, if you think badly and act badly now, you set up problems for tomorrow. You may not see them right away, but you set up problems for tomorrow. So in between verses 47 and 52, I simply would just make a note that Saul's earlier commitments set up the problems of a later continual opportunity for the Philistines. Not only that, but in verse 47 it says, when Saul had taken the kingdom over Israel, he fought against the enemies on every side: Moab, Ammon, Edom, the sons of Zovah, the Philistines, and wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment. He acted valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan, Ishvi, Malchishua, and the names of his daughters were Merav, and the other one was Michal. The name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz. And the name of the captain of his army was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle. Kish, the father of Saul, and Ner, the father of Abner, was the son of Aviel. Now you're asking all these names and you say, why do I need these? Because these guys are going to pop up in the story later. Just remember, when somebody drops in and spends time telling you the names of people, either one of two things is going to happen. They're introduced earlier in the script so that later on they can show you their part in the drama, or the meaning of their name means something. In this case, it's the earlier one. It's that they're going to show up later. The war against the Philistine was severe all the days of Saul. I want you to underline in your text in verse 52, the war against the Philistines was severe all the days of Saul. That's the result of his rush to make a vow for the people. Had they crushed the Philistines when God gave them the ability to do it, they would not have had that statement in 52. They would not have had the constant problem. So today, I can have an opportunity from the Lord to deal with something in my life. And if I don't, I may pay for it for the next 25 years. So I need to be aware of what God is telling me. I need to be aware of the victories that can be mine. And I need to step into them. Now, you get to chapter 15 and you get to the belly flop of Saul. I mean, this is pretty much the way it actually all breaks down. And you know this story. In verses 1 through 7, you have this choose a side. Just 3 words, choose a side. That's admonition number 1. I want to tell you about some admonitions that'll keep you where you belong. The first one is choose a side. God has a plan that he's working. Failure to follow the word puts us on the wrong side of the battle. So, in verse 1, Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against them while they were coming from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has." Would you please underline, utterly destroy all that he has. Then I want you to underline, do not spare him. Then in the last part of verse 3, underline death, man, woman, child, infant, ox, sheep, camel, donkey. Is it clear what God said through Samuel's mouth? Kill them all. Leave none. What about the donkeys? Yes, kill the donkeys. How about camels? Yes, kill the camels. How about the sheep? Yes, the sheep. Yes, the goats. Yes, the children. Yes, the men. Yes, the women. Yes, 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 yes. All. Now this sounds so extreme, doesn't it? But here's the thing. With Saul and with many of us, because Saul liked to interpret what he thought obedience might be, God just said, all. That way there's no question about what all is. But somehow in our own minds, we have the ability to rationalize sin. And all sounds like most. It just sounds just so similar in our mind. Look what happens. Then Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men of Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the valley. Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, depart, go down from the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the sons of Israel when they came up from Egypt." So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He captured Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. Would you underline alive? Utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. And Saul and the people spared Agag, which you underline spared, and the best of the sheep, underline best, oxen, fatlings, lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless they utterly destroyed. So when God said all, the first admonition I gave you in verses 1 through 7 was choose a side. The second one is look through God's eyes. Saul likely had no concept of the total picture of God's agenda, nor the cost of his disobedience. Saul killed the people as instructed, but did not kill Agag, the tribal chief, nor the best of the animals. Little did Saul know that the enemy of the people of God would use this time in a battle between God and Satan in cosmic places. The story isn't the story. The story is what is happening behind it. Satan had a purpose for the Amalekites. He had a purpose for Agag. Agag was going to do something that was going to help him, not that day, not that year, not that decade, not that century, but much later, there was going to be a result of Agag being spared. Let me see if I can show you what it is. What does he do? He captures him. And it says, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself. You know, in all humility, I'll just set up this statue of me. Ding! And it says, he set up a monument for himself, then turned and proceeded down to Gilgal. Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have carried out the command of the Lord. Now look, I want you to hear something. One of the problems here is that there's a huge backstory to what's going on here. But Saul only knows that Saul actually dealt with what Saul thought he should do. I want you to write next to verse 8 of chapter 15, Esther chapter 3, verse 1. Esther chapter 3, verse 1. What he did was he took Agag and his harem and he let him live. In the meantime, Agag impregnated someone, and the children of the Agagites continued to live. So they killed all the active children, but he didn't kill him or remove him into a place where he couldn't have any future. When you get to Esther chapter 3, Haman is an Agagi. He's a child of Agag. In other words, he's an Agagi Amalekite. Had Saul done what he was supposed to do, Haman would never have been there to try and wipe out all Israel. So the enemy of Israel was working, Satan was working already to set up Israel all the way into the time of Esther. We're talking about the 5th century BC, 400s BC. This is 1100 BC, and the chess game is already in play. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do. So instead of killing him, he gives him an opportunity to be honored, have his little harem, have his little fling, have children, and those are not exterminated. Agag is later killed, but whatever women that were there at the time were not killed. And as a result, this disobedience shows up later in the Bible. This is just another one of those circumstances where, Abraham can't keep his pants on, and now we have a Middle East conflict. It's another one of those same things. It's your sin today comes back and bites somebody later. You may never even know them, but they may be your children's 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 children. And all that happens is you just go, hey, I only compromised on something small, but what you don't realize is what it plays out within the future. Let me suggest to you that Saul was pretty satisfied with himself. But he never stopped to ask the one key question that he should have. What's the question Saul didn't ask in his own mind? He feels pretty satisfied. He set up a monument to himself. That sounds like he's satisfied with himself. Here's the question he never asked. Is God happy with me? Let me just say it this way. If God ain't happy, doesn't matter who else is. If God's not happy with your life, it doesn't matter that you're happy with your life. It doesn't matter that the people around you think you're doing great. If God isn't happy with your life, it doesn't matter who thinks they're happy with your life. So Saul is all self-satisfied. But what's interesting to me is Saul's a mess. Now, I gave you a couple of admonitions. The first one was choose a side. The second one was see it through God's eyes, or look through God's eyes. When I pick this up around about verse 13 or 14, my third admonition is take responsibility for what God says. Or you forego blessing. Take responsibility. Own your choices. Guys, if you come in to see me for counseling, you will hear these words. Own your choices. I guarantee you, because most people make choices and act like somebody else did it to them. We have to own the choices we make. Let me show you what I'm talking about. When you get down here, it says, you hear Saul in verse 13. Blessed are you of the Lord, I've carried out the command of the Lord. But Samuel said, what then is the bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? This is a great moment in the Bible. Caught with hand in cookie jar. If you did what I told you, how come I'm hearing sheep and oxen? Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep, oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. But the rest we have utterly destroyed. I want you to notice the pronouns. Verse 15 is really important. Circle they. They have brought them. Then circle for the people spared. Now go down to the end. We destroyed. In other words, the part of it that meant obedience, he took responsibility for. The part that was disobedience, he dissed off on his people. Somewhere make a note. Saul wasn't acting as a king. He said the people did it, as if he wasn't responsible for the behavior of his people. You can't be a leader by following the polls. You can't be a leader by letting people do what they want and then arguing it wasn't your fault because the people did it. If you're the leader, you take responsibility for what was done under your charge. So he says, I'll take responsibility for the part where we obeyed, but they did the other part. You don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. I think what's interesting is verse 16 says, and Samuel said to Saul, wait, let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. He said, speak. Samuel said, is it not true, though you were little in your own eyes, that is insecure and insignificant in your own eyes, you were made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed you king over Israel? He said, don't you remember when you started, you were all so small and all shucks, I come from a small town and I'm really nobody? Don't you remember hiding behind the baggage when I was trying to anoint you king? And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they're exterminated. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord? Then Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord and went on the mission on which the Lord sent me and have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest things of the devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And I cannot tell you, every year somebody asks me, is it significant that he keeps saying Lord your God instead of the Lord our God? I do not know. I can only tell you that that's a weird thing to be saying. It's a weird thing to be saying your God. You know, if I start saying now that Jesus you follow, well, hello, or am I with you or not? It's strange the way he's speaking. This is the very famous part of this saying. He says, Samuel said, has the Lord much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices? As in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. I don't want you to knock yourself out in sacrifices to me. I want you to listen to me. I don't want you to buy me stuff, she says to him. I want you to sit down and talk to me and listen to me. The Lord says the same thing. I don't want you to go bring me sheep and goats. You think I don't have enough sheep and goats? I can make more. What I want is people that are not unpredictable. Leaders that don't follow me are unpredictable leaders. I can't do anything with you. Rebellion is as the sin of divination. That's the word for witchcraft. And insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Which is worse to the Lord? To have the person who is not taking commands when he gives them, or a person who's bowing before another god? Identical. Because it doesn't matter what your form of rebellion or mutiny is, it's mutiny when you don't listen to God. I think what's interesting is go to the rest of the passage and you will see a sad story. Saul begging, I have sinned, I have indeed transgressed the command of the Lord. Pardon my sin, verse 25. Return with me that I might worship the Lord. Verse 26, I will not return with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord. The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. I want you to notice verse 26 because there's an awful lot of Christians who cannot suck it up and understand that there is a point at which God says, I'm done. Our view of grace means unlimited opportunities and chances, and that's not God's view of grace. It should occur to you that people get chances until they don't. That is, everybody has a chance to receive Jesus until they die. There's no provision for the person who decides to reject Jesus in this life to get a second dip in an afterlife. The bottom line here is God is a God who sets the limits, but where the fence is, that's the fence. Okay? So, unfortunately, a lot of people have torqued grace to just keep acting like there's never a judgment day. There is. As Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe and it tore. So Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor. Now watch this phrase, underline it, who is better than you. Saul started his reign as an insecure man, not thinking he was as good as others. He ended by hearing Samuel say, you're not as good as the one that's going to follow you. This is the seed that is first planted of the jealousy that grows up in his heart. Because when David is made known to him, he knows that David is a better man. Why? Because it came right out of Samuel's mouth. The very first time Saul heard about the next runner-up was he's a better man than you. That's why that phrase is incredibly important. Also, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind. He is not a man that he should change his mind. Then he said, I have sinned. Please honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel, and go back with me that I may worship the Lord your God. Samuel went back following Saul. Saul worshiped the Lord. Then Samuel said, bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. Agag came to him cheerfully, and Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel chopped Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. This is one of the killer prophets, Samuel. Another one will be Elijah, who will come up against the prophets of Baal and slaughter them in Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. So you see this kind of prototypical pattern. But here's what I want you to see. God really deals directly with Samuel. And when you get to the next segment, I just want you to read the end of chapter 15. Samuel went to Ramah, but Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. Now listen, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul. Underline, Samuel grieved over Saul. The Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Again, when the writer tells you how the Lord feels, the word for God's emotions are different than anybody else's emotions. Okay? God is unique. He's not like a man. So what does it mean that the Lord regretted that he made Saul king? You will never know the answer to the question. Whenever emotions are applied to God, they are unique to him alone. Okay? Whatever anger is of the Lord, it's not like anger when Abby's angry. She gets angry in a different way than the Lord gets angry. And none of us can be angry the way the Lord is angry. Because anger is mixed with ego in all of us. Okay? It's not with God. Whenever he gets angry, he tends to do something merciful, which is really unbelievable. Okay? Whenever I get angry, there is no mercy in my anger. He's very different. What I can tell you is that God communicated to Samuel, yeah, Saul, that wasn't a good one to make king. Now, does that mean that God changed his mind? No, clearly not, because the text says he didn't. What does it mean? It means you're to walk away with this sense that Samuel felt broken over Saul. But can I suggest something to you before we go to a break? I think that God helped Samuel by letting him feel that it wasn't his fault. God took the responsibility for it. I think that's what that's supposed to say. I think it's God communicated to him, it's not that you picked the wrong guy. Remember, I told you who to pick. It's me who did this, not you. And I think it was a way of God settling Samuel. But it leaves Samuel depressed. So we come out of chapter 15 with a depressed Samuel, a deposed or about to be deposed over the long haul by the end of the book, Saul, Jonathan, who's had a pretty good day out in the field of battle but doesn't realize his dad's a real dingbat. And what we end up with is a story that actually closes on a sad point.